I am Michelle Evans, and I'm here to tell you the story of the most amazing experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies. But more importantly, to introduce you to the people who made that happen. This is the X-15 rocket plane and the men who flew the first wings into space. Let me start with a short excerpt. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boomtown from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of that silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled as the quiet was shattered by a sonic boom. The X-15, with pilot Jack McKay at the controls, had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skid slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. A chain reaction began as the now crippled aircraft went out of control. The left wing and rear stabilizer scraped along the ground, ripping the stabilizer from its mount. The wing continued to slide, pivoting the aircraft, then flipping the X-15 onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to rest on its back as McKay had feared, but with the canopy now gone, the weight of the aircraft now transferred to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. A helicopter moved in, using its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. It took 9 years to achieve Mach 1, Mach 2, and Mach 3. The last of these cost the life of Mel Apt. Gaining speed was a dangerous business. Yet a winged rocket ship, which could double those records in just a few short years, went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics for North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. Scott is seen here with the chief test pilots for the NACA and U.S. Air Force, Joe Walker and Ivan Kinchlow. Unfortunately, Ivan Kinchlow did not survive long enough to fly the X-15 and was killed in an F-104 accident. Now, construction at the North American Aviation Facility near Los Angeles International Airport was kept from prying eyes. As you can see here, they actually built a fence around the X-15 so that even others at North American could not see what was going on until 15 October 1958, just 2 weeks after NASA was first formed, the X-15 was unveiled to the public, and all that classification just dropped away. Vice President Richard Nixon said that day, "The X-15 is exciting because of the fact that it is designed to carry man into space for the first time. It is an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are men to be envious, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries. It is useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs." Now, an integral part of the X-15 was the MC-2 pressure suit, seen here worn by Scott Crossfield. It came from the David Clark Company, which had previously specialized in the manufacture of women's undergarments. Crossfield once wrote about that, saying, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous, and a machine which can build a good one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important and expanding girdle market. Braving new frontiers, Clark moved into the manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those structural loads, was even more awesome. This then gave the David Clark Company the proper foundation on which to build America's first spacesuits, and they're still building them for American astronauts today. Now, the cockpit was a very tight fit, as you can see in this extreme fisheye view inside the X-15. And they prepared for months for the first flight, but problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership's wing, where it was repeatedly fueled and checked out. Finally, on Monday, 8 June 1959, the X-15 achieved its first flight, dropping from the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m. Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 toward the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near disastrous pilot-induced oscillation, but he was able to expertly touch down at the bottom of one of these oscillations, and the first flight was a complete success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could leave the cockpit. At the time, everyone believed that the X-15 would be the vehicle that would put the first man into space. The second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September 1959. Rocket engine development was behind schedule, so the XLR-11 rockets were installed. These are the same which had powered Chuck Yeager and the X-1 to the very first supersonic flight back in 1947. Those LR-11s worked perfectly. Touchdown of the first powered flight. The third powered flight, however, didn't go quite so well, as you can see here. A fire in the engine compartment and an overweight landing broke the back of X-15 number 2. But the number 1 was still there to continue flight testing, while number 2 was sent back to North American to be repaired. And while the initial flight test continued, the third X-15 was being prepared for the 60,000-pound thrust XLR-99 rocket engine, which is what the X-15 was designed to use as a power plant in the first place. Now, here at the propulsion system test facility, they could test fire 2 X-15s. Note Scotty's red and white Beechcraft Bonanza way up in the upper left corner. Scott's daughter, Sally, told me, in the X-15 days, he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we had moved from Lancaster down to Los Angeles, and this was the only way he could get any home time through the traffic patterns of Los Angeles. The powers that be at North American, however, did not like him flying his personal plane because they thought that was just too dangerous. How's that for ironic for a rocket test pilot? Now, this is what a successful LR-99 rocket engine firing should look like in the stand, but on 8 June 1960, it did not go as planned. A valve stuck, causing a fuel explosion, literally blowing the X-15 in half. Scotty, in the forward section of the X-15, shot forward 25 feet, but he did not suffer any major injuries. After being hosed down by firemen, Scotty famously said the headline should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now, here's one of the only photos showing the first 4 pilots. You've got Forrest Petersen from the US Navy, Scott Crossfield from the contractor North American, Bob White was now the chief test pilot for the Air Force after replacing Ivan Kinchlew when he was killed in the F-104 crash. And finally, Joe Walker of NASA. Notice that Forrest Petersen of the Navy was often left out, as you can see in this publicity photo. We'll talk more about him a bit later. Now, finally, Scotty had to leave. At one point, Scotty suggested that he be the only one to fly this aircraft. And, you know, it was because he had helped design it and build it, and he wanted to fly it more than anything. But he really did need to leave. The contractor needed to finish. And here we see Bob White symbolically taking the keys from Scott while Neil Armstrong of NASA looks on. They wanted this aircraft so they could get going. Now here's a typical mission profile for an X-15. The X-15 was the very first experimental aircraft to be able to leave the local area of Edwards Air Force Base. This required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range, with 2 tracking stations that followed every flight from Beatty, Nevada, just east of Death Valley, to Ely, near the northeastern corner of Nevada, 9,300 feet up in the mountains, where, as you can see here, it does get a bit cold at times. I tried to get up to this site myself in June and was still turned away by snow. Now here's a group shot of the first batch of X-15 pilots. The primary and the backup were bookended by Bob Rushworth at the nose of the X-15, who was the backup to Bob White, who was on the other side. And then we have Jack McKay from NASA, who was the backup to Joe Walker. And the second backup for Joe Walker in NASA was Neil Armstrong. And in the center, Forrest Petersen from the Navy, who did not have any backups. He was the only Navy pilot allowed on the program. Now, first up after Scotty was Joe Walker. He was a relaxed old country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And here he is stepping out of the suiting van and heading for the X-15 and dropping away on the very first NASA flight on 25 March of 1960. Notice that NASA wasted no time in emblazoning their bright yellow logo on the rocket plane's tail. They wanted the world to know who was in charge of the X-15. And also, I want you to compare the post-recovery requirements of an X-15 seen here in one of its early flights, where we've got a bunch of people standing around, firemen are out there, the control van is there. But remember, this is happening at the same time we were flying Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo on the way to the moon. Those vehicles required an entire Navy flotilla in order to recover a spacecraft returning from orbit or from the moon, where the X-15 could make precise landings and just be towed back to the hangar. Now, Joe Walker took the X-15 literally to the heights. On 22 August of 1963, Walker topped out the X-15 program at 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles high, about 10 times the height of a commercial airline flight. And with no air, attitude control jets, as you see here, were required to keep the rocket plane properly oriented before a human-controlled reentry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the pilots of the X-15. Joe's eloquent perspective of this flight, he said, the overhead aspect is just like one of these dark velvet photographer's cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there weren't any specks of light shining through that I could pick out. He remarked, by gosh, it's dark up here today. Quite a different view. What a beautiful day this is. Now, it can probably be said that of the 12 X-15 pilots, Joe appeared to enjoy the ride more than anyone else. He said, you know, you've got a long time to where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had any better sense, I would have looked around more. Joe completed a stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief pilot on the XB-70A Valkyrie bomber, also built by North American Aviation. Unfortunately, on 8 June 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on the giant B-70. His F-104, seen here with the orange tail below the B-70, was asked to slide in a little tighter for photographs they were taking that day, and his fighter was caught in the wingtip vortex of the giant bomber and flipped over the top of the B-70. A frantic call of "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as the F-104 rolled across the top of the bomber. The B-70 was also crippled and went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross. But B-70 pilot Al White, who had been Crossfield's backup on the X-15 program, although he never got to fly, did survive, although he had very serious injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Robert White, seen here with Joe Walker while he was still flying the program. These two guys were the primary X-15 record setters. And here White prepares for the drop and a very short 10-minute rocket flight to come. That's all it was. Once you were off the wing of the B-52, you were going to be on the ground somewhere within about 10 minutes. You can see in this picture his helmet, he's got his head down, he's checking his switch positions, just getting ready to hit that launch switch and start his mission. Bob White was the only man to be the first to surpass 3 Mach numbers. Everybody knows Chuck Yeager, the first man at Mach 1. Scott Crossfield, who later flew the X-15, was the first man to Mach 2, and the first Mach 3 was Mel Apt in the X-2, and he lost his life doing that. Bob told me, you know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was the first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, if some NASA guy had come up and said, hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these records too, well, I'm not quite sure what would have happened. The Air Force did love to set their records. Now, White was so proud of his skills as an X-15 pilot, so much so that he bet a martini that he could set that rocket plane down within just 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point on the Rogers Dry Lake bed. And that's not bad when you consider he's gliding back from suborbital space using 1950s analog technology. But he won his bet on nearly every one of his 16 flights. Bob really liked his martinis. And after becoming the first pilot to exceed 300,000 feet on 17 July 1962, White had to really get out quick and get cleaned up so he could catch a commercial flight to head for Washington, D.C., where he was to receive the Collier Trophy with fellow pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Petersen. President John F. Kennedy that day said, "We are very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest we have, who took a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and over 4,000 miles per hour. We're very proud to have them here, not only for what they've done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." Now here's a comparison of the LR-11 and LR-99 rocket engines. It took 2 of the 4-chambered LR-11s on the left to achieve 16,000 pounds of thrust, whereas the LR-99 punched in with 60,000 pounds of thrust in a package just 6 feet long with just a single chamber. Here's the twin LR-11s firing in the test stand as configured for the X-15, and the X-15 under power with those twin LR-11s. Maximum speed achieved was Mach 3.5, but that was only half of what was envisioned once the LR-99 was installed. Now here's a very impressive single chamber LR-99 firing in the test stand and installed in an X-15 ready for flight. Now Forrest Petersen was the only US Navy pilot on the X-15 program. While serving on the X-15, he was up for promotion, but to get that in the Navy required sea duty. Now that's hard to come by when you're assigned to a base in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Now, a way was found around the requirement by assigning him to a naval squadron just north of Edwards at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station. Petersen said to me, all they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake, yet I stayed at the same office at Edwards where I'd been. And China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers, but that didn't matter. After a year, I accumulated my so-called sea duty, and they promoted me to commander. And you can see some enterprising NASA tech put this little shield on the side of the vehicle to commemorate that milestone for Forrest. Now, on 10 January 1962, Petersen made his last flight, which turned out to be the first emergency landing outside of the Edwards Air Force Base area. After landing safely at Mud Dry Lake near Tonopah, Nevada, several hundred miles away, the X-15 then had to be trucked overland back to Edwards. And it's a long trip, so it always, of course, requires a stop for gas and a snack. Petersen had to leave the X-15 in order to resume his naval career, which eventually included commanding the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. I guess you could say he was the original Captain Kirk. Now, Jack McKay is seen here with his wife, Shirley, and first daughter, Sherry. He came aboard as the second NASA X-15 pilot. Strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for launch altitude on the morning of 9 November 1962. Things did not go well on that flight, as I read to you in that excerpt from chapter 5 of my book at the beginning of this talk. Here is the aftermath of what that crash landing looked like. You can see the shadow of the H-21 helicopter hovering above the crippled and upside down X-15 number 2. McKay has already been dug out and is on his way to the hospital. Operations engineer Bill Albrecht told me Jack McKay saved his own life. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned the canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, by the time they get here to try to rescue me, I'll be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who wouldn't expect this to be a total loss? It's amazing that McKay even survived. Bill continued, saying, my first view of it was from the window of the C-47 Goonie Bird, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake. When I saw that thing lying upside down, I said, that's the end of that airplane. But a steel airplane, that's something else. It's tough stuff. And although severely injured, McKay returned to the program and accomplished 22 more X-15 research flights, although he did experience 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September 1966. And McKay was a family man with 8 children, seen here with 2 of them at Red Rock Canyon. In the end, those injuries from 1962 shortened his life, and he died 13 years later in 1975. His daughter Sherry told me, most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they're just killed outright. They aren't hanging around in the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen to them. I think my father felt alienated from everyone and everything, and he was in a tremendous amount of pain. Up next was Bob Rushworth. He became the most successful X-15 pilot of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Paul Bickle, the head of the X-15 program, related to me what Bob White said of Rushworth. He ran into my office one day and he said, he's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get on the X-15 program, and he said he had to think about it for a week. And he even had to go home and ask his wife. John Perry, the engineer in charge of the X-15 flight simulator, related to me that it was not a good idea for Bob White to get on Bickle's bad side. If we misjudged something, Bickle was not at all reluctant to let you know. So we used to say, if you mess up, you're going to end up in the Bickle barrel. Now, as you can see by this photo, the F-104 and X-15 were very similar in shape and size. The F-104 was the perfect way for the X-15 pilots to practice their landings, something Rushworth and all X-15 pilots did hundreds of times throughout the program. And after that McKay accident in 1962, remember that mess that you saw on Mud Lake lying upside down? Well, about 18 months later, this is what that same aircraft now looked like. North American rebuilt it into the X-15A2. It was 29 inches longer, and the most notable outward appearance was also the addition of these external tanks, which could extend the range of speed and height that the X-15 might be able to reach. With those external tanks in place, this updated version could really push the edge of what the X-15 was capable of. They were shooting for Mach 8. Like the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle, the tanks would be jettisoned around Mach 2. On Rushworth's final flight, it was the first with full fuel tanks. However, El Cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow and the tanks were erroneously jettisoned. Another emergency landing into Mud Lake. Now, around the middle of the program, we've got another shot of the group of X-15 pilots. You've got Jack McKay, who is now the head NASA pilot, as Joe Walker next to him is about to step down. And Jack McKay's backup at NASA is now Milt Thompson there in the middle. And then on the right side, we have Bob Rushworth, the head Air Force pilot, with his new backup, Joe Engle. I'm very proud that Joe Engle is also the person who wrote the foreword for my book. Joe became a really great friend of mine. We spoke at places across the country together, including at the Air Force Academy. We just lost Joe a little over a year ago. He was the last of the X-15 pilots to survive. A really, really, truly wonderful man. Now, not shown in that photo is Neil Armstrong, who became the 7th X-15 pilot. I always love this photo of him. Neil always looks so young. This is almost like Daddy Take Me to Work Day or something. And it was a terrible thing when we lost him back in the summer of 2012. It's hard to believe that he is now gone as well. Here's Armstrong with a couple of X-15 engineers, John McTeague and Elmore Adkins. You can see the shape of the X-15 above their heads there. Right behind Neil's head is the nose wheel of the X-15, which has yet to be loaded into the fuselage. It's loaded onto the wing of the B-52, getting ready for flight. And here's Neil leaving the suiting van and heading out to the rocket plane. And finally, ready for drop. Roger Barnicky, who worked on the life support systems, in other words, the pressure suit that kept them alive while they were flying at altitude, said, I watched them get ready for a flight and come back and just have the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved, and it really showed how much they enjoyed flying. This was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. So, of course, I asked Roger, what happened if something screwed up in the airplane that was the pilot's fault? Well, then they were kind of quiet, but they didn't hide things. And Neil, contrary to what you might think, screwed up on several occasions, such as the flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere in the X-15, or almost crashing his F-104 while checking out a dry lake bed for an upcoming X-15 flight, just because he did not judge his altitude correctly. This is the aftermath of what that little incident looked like. His boss, Paul Bickle, described the scene for me. Neil realized what he'd done, so he firewalled the F-104, but while the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one of the tip tanks off and dragged the ventral right off the tail, which released the arrestor hook back there. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems and the radio antenna, which left him without any radio, only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. Now, in F-104, the landing gear comes out from the middle and spreads outward. Here they're measuring the landing gear on Neil's F-104 to see just how close he got to the ground before he was finally able to start picking up some altitude again. You could see how close he got. Continuing, Bickle went on saying, he knew he had problems, but he didn't know what, so he figured he'd make a flaps-up landing at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas, but this hook is hanging out the back. He snagged that arresting chain across the approach end of the runway at 220 knots, just tore the chain right out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway, dragging all this junk, blew out his tires. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours just getting the runway cleared off. Then Milt Thompson goes up in a two-place F-104B to bring Neil back down, and he overshot the runway, blew his tires off, and tied the thing up again. The aerodrome officer called me and said, hey, you guys, please don't send any more of your airplanes up here. We'll load all your guys into one of ours and bring them back to you. It was truly a disgraceful display all round. After that, Neil left for Houston and the astronaut office, and the rest, as we say, is history. Now, early in Joe Engle's career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Joe said, I was the new guy on the program, and my boss, Bob Rushworth, said, you're going to go down to the hangar, you're going to stand by the X-15, just stand there, you won't have to say a thing. Humphrey came up and said, well, what have we here? Scared the hell out of me because I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe's great, and he recovered quickly, replying to Humphrey, well, it's the X-15, sir. The vice president thought a moment, then said, oh, yes, yes. Now, how many squadrons of these do we have? Engle wasn't quite sure what to say, since there's only 3 aircraft, but he replied, well, not very many, sir. Humphrey said, well, obviously we need more of these things. I'll fix that as soon as I get back to Washington. Engle went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights in the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the Southwest, as seen here. This picture shows Las Vegas at the bottom center with Lake Mead extending off to the upper left. It was a real heck of a view that these people got to go and see. And here's a dramatic reentry from suborbital space as envisioned by my friend, artist Tommy Eriksson from Gothenburg, Sweden. He and I worked together for over 6 years producing the images for my book, and which you see here in the slideshow. He just did a magnificent job on envisioning the X-15. I explained I wanted images of the X-15 as could never be photographed, and he provided that in spades. Just amazing work that Tommy did. And he even used his work on this project as part of his PhD thesis and used this to become Dr. Tommy Eriksson. Very, very proud of that fact. Now, many others were excited about the X-15. Even as astronauts prepared to fly to the moon, Wernher von Braun, the architect of Apollo, wanted to know what it would be like to fly in a winged aircraft into space. So he climbed into the X-15 cockpit at Edwards one day. And here's Miss Edwards of 1962, Wanda Capps, who gets a lift from the wing of the X-15. And how about the cast and crew from the TV show Star Trek, which was in production at this time, who beamed down to Edwards to check out the real deal? Now, the X-15 is often considered a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it as well. They were called computers, and they took all the data and plotted it out for the engineers using calculators, paper, and pens. Without the women, the engineering data from the X-15 meant absolutely nothing. Like Neil, Joe left for Houston and was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, the sixth lunar landing. Unfortunately, budget cuts canceled the final three Apollo missions, 18, 19, and 20, and scientists really pushed to get a scientist on board the final flight of Apollo on Apollo 17. And unfortunately, Joe lost his seat as a lunar module pilot for the replacement by scientist Jack Smith. But after getting bumped from Apollo, Joe finally did fly two more missions into space, commanding the space shuttle STS-2 in 1981 and STS-51I in 1985. Joe is the only astronaut who had earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit because of his 3 X-15 qualification flights into space. Now, Milt Thompson was a man torn between two flight test programs, and he also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in space. X-15, amazing movie. The poster here tells you actually filmed in space, and of course, Hollywood would never, ever lie to you, right? Now, Milt recalled being involved for approximately 3 months on this project. I think they were here on site probably a couple months, and after that, we went down and spent a month in Hollywood during the cutting process. Did he have any input on how to make the film better? Oh yeah, a lot of stuff. It was completely wrong on so many things. They really didn't understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote this script had apparently never been around an airplane. Now here's Charles Bronson as an X-15 pilot in the movie, seen here with real pilot Bob White. And in her very first big screen role, Mary Tyler Moore shows us the proper fashions to wear while working around rocket planes out on the lake bed with her high heels. But now the hype did not end there. Here's a couple of scenes from the movie Battle in Outer Space, where those supposed squadrons of X-15s that Hubert Humphrey ordered got put into service battling aliens. It was so cool. You've got gantry launched, silo launched, silver X-15s with red racing stripes. And what X-15 would not be complete without a death ray in its nose? People forgot how popular the X-15 was at the time. It was used to advertise a company's participation in the high-flying program, or maybe just get your attention by calling your product the Kodak Instamatic X-15. Yes, there is a camera in that photograph there. Now, besides film and advertising, there were many books, including the fictional adventures for young readers of Mike Mars. There are 2 of them in this series. Mike Mars Flies the X-15 and Mike Mars South Pole Spaceman. There were 8 in the overall series. They were really fun. It was lots of fun. Mike Mars South Pole Spaceman actually inspired me. I take my talk all over the world, and I gave my talk in Antarctica just a couple of years ago, which was pretty neat to be able to do. I've given my talk now on 5 continents. And here's a really cool X-15 runaround friction toy from that era. And even with me being OCD about the X-15, I didn't even buy this. This went on eBay for over $900. So X-15 is still very well regarded today. And in 2006, the post office issued 2 X-15 stamps, which also happened to be holograms. Very cool. But you didn't buy a lot of these. This one was $4.05 back in 2006. The second X-15 stamp was $14.95 each. After 14 flights and a chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished on the X-15. He said, "It was busy on the altitude flights. I really only got the chance to look out the window once, and that was on my last flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly well settled. Then I looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco to Baja, California. It was beautiful up there. But you just have a few precious seconds to take a look." Milt was the first to fly the lifting body type, seen here the M2F2 right behind him, and Paul Bickle gave him the choice of one program or the other. He said, "You got too much on your plate," and contrary to what you might think, he went on to the lifting body program over the X-15. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was the X-15A2 with those external tanks, which he inherited from Bob Rushworth when he retired from the program. Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is considered the most famous, while another was one of the most dangerous. The program built up speed, testing out the capability of those tanks. And one primary purpose of those high-speed flights was to test what's called a scramjet, supersonic combustion ramjet, a dummy of which is seen mounted to the lower ventral of the X-15 here. After years of work, this scramjet never came to fruition and has only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocities. And before continuing with the A2, on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched, and soon afterward, all electrical power in the rocket plane died. No one knew where he was, or even if he was still alive. Knight told me I was a little over Mach 4, and the airplane was just wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up over 70 degrees of bank angle, and I looked down and saw Mono Lake. I told myself, you better enjoy that view because that's the last one you're going to see. My thoughts were that this is going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4. That's the limit on the ejection seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it. I'll see what happens, see how long I can control it. Once I lose it, well, then I have no choice but to bail out. As the aircraft went over the top, I started an auxiliary power unit. At least that gave me hydraulics to control the reentry. I didn't have any instruments and there were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around and pulled about 6 Gs to go back to mud. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Knight landed safely, but it took quite a while to find him sitting on Mud Lake. The way that it works is that they have this whole series of dry lake beds as you progress from your launch lake to the Edwards dry lake. So there's always a place to land somewhere along the way. And it's done by the clock. If it happens between such and such second and such second, then you go to this lake. If it's after that, you go to the next lake until you make it back to Edwards. It happened right on the break point between 2 dry lakes. Everybody assumed he would go forward to Grapevine. He did not. He hated that lake, so he turned around and went to Mud. And so nobody even thought to look for him for like over a half an hour back at Mud. But once they arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards. The X-15 was made ready for yet another convoy, several hundred miles back to base. Now, made to protect the X-15A2 and its pilot at speeds of up to Mach 8, this Martin ablator, as you see here, which was sprayed onto the X-15 skin, had the consistency of a pencil eraser, along with the color. But this stuff was oxygen sensitive, meaning oxygen could soak in, and if something struck the ablative, it could literally explode. Not to mention, as Knight explained very emphatically to me, it was pink. I was not going to fly a pink airplane. So they put a white paint layer on top, added above the pink, and Pete then felt it was safe to come near the X-15 once again. And there's a nice portrait of North American Aviation's two white beauties, the XB-70 Valkyrie bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane, now nicknamed the White Knight in honor of Pete Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon on 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52 with the fully loaded, ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and made his speed run, topping out at Mach 6.70. That's 4,520 miles per hour. That's coast to coast in less than a half an hour. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft was in peril as shock waves burned through the X-15 skin because of those shock waves coming off that dummy scramjet on the bottom of the X-15. Something engineers should have seen coming. It was really a dumb thing on their part that they never understood that those shock waves would cause such peril. After landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost this X-15. The aircraft would never fly again. And for surviving that high-speed flight, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program. And the best way to get used to flying at Mach 6 or 300,000 feet was to sit in a hangar and fly what they called the Iron Bird, the X-15 simulator, usually while sitting there drinking a cup of coffee and talking to your fellow pilots and engineers. Now here inside the hangar, there are 3 X-15s, lifting bodies, and other experimental aircraft of all shapes, sizes, and colors. This is a far cry from the mundane scene in this same hangar today. This is what the hangar looked like when, as a kid, I used to visit the NASA facility at Edwards. This is what got me excited about the X-15 program, going into engineering, and eventually writing the book that I wanted to write. Now here's an unexplained Band-Aid on Dana's nose the day prior to his first flight. When we spoke, he refused to tell me how he got that. Maybe he got into an altercation with the simulator, who knows? He was very tight-lipped about that. Now, by this time in the program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This image shows the X-15 as it has never been seen before, working in space with instruments deployed. Solar spectrum, missile launch signature detection, high altitude balloon deployment, and Bill's favorite, I do say this a bit sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. Dana told me, I remember there was this big meteor shower, and to get out here to Edwards for that early flight, I had to drive back to work in the dark. I have never, ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 as I came in from Lancaster. And those were the micrometeorites they were sending me up to try to capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. So, of course, I asked him, well, what of the possibility of capturing one through the X-15 cockpit rather than the experiment out on the left wingtip pod? Bill stated quietly and hopefully, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. Bill survived his high-altitude experiment flights just fine. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams, from the United States Air Force. After being accepted as an astronaut in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, he saw the writing on the wall that they were never going to get off the launch pad. So he asked for and got a transfer to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after the high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backwards along its flight path for re-entry. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent him into a hypersonic spin, knocking him out. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion, which exceeded the structural limits of the airframe, breaking the X-15 apart. Near Ridgecrest, the remains of X-15 number 3 crashed into the desert at 10:35 a.m., just 5 minutes after he had dropped off the B-52's wings. Bob White told me, I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing. Boy, this is not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one I operated with. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Badelsky now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life. It has been greatly expanded over the years. You can see the original memorial there in the lower right corner. It's really wonderful. We have visitors from all over the world paying their respects and honoring Mike Adams. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times during the coming year before coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October of 1968. With a total of 199 flights, the hope was to always have made it to a nice even 200 before the end of the year. The last of 8 attempts was made on 20 December. With all systems operational, Pete Knight was near the X-15, ready to board for the B-52 takeoff roll. The clouds opened up with a freak snowstorm, and Paul Bickle said, "We're aborting this flight. Somebody is trying to tell us something." The X-15 program was officially completed. The number 1 X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and number 2 went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Here, 7 of the pilots celebrate the X-15 at the Smithsonian soon after it arrived. The X-15 created 8 new astronauts, 5 from the Air Force and 3 from NASA. The Air Force took care of their own at the time it happened in the 1960s, but it took until 2005 for NASA to recognize the achievements of Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Bill Dana. Bill was the only one who was still with us to receive his wings that day. What could have come next? A possible Delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident since the number 3 aircraft had been slated for that program. Or maybe a scramjet-powered model, the true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the nearly half a century since the program was completed. No manned X-plane may ever again achieve what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 and the people who made it happen may instead inspire a new generation to take flight in a quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 bid you a farewell and a good day, and I thank you for being with me. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that anyone has after viewing this program. It's always a great pleasure to speak about the X-15. So with that, I want to thank Vince very much for allowing me to be here today. And it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much.